Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, it's kind of old news that RPGs, gaming can be kind of a window into our psyche, or at least a way to explore it. And probably one of the most classic examples of that is the person that feels kind of impotent in their day-to-day life, and so they end up playing these hyper-competent characters in this effort to kind of feel competent, like you feel as though their decisions matter, that they have some ability to affect the world. And strangely enough, this video is sort of about that. Not really. But anyhow, follow me down this rabbit hole. My girlfriend likes really violent movies. She likes other kinds of movies as well. But, very often we kind of joke about this. Often I'll walk by the living room and I'll just ask her, well, how many people have died so far? Because, invariably I'll walk in to the room when there's some horrific scene of some kind of brutal murder or the aftermath of a brutal murder. And sometimes it's actual documentaries about serial killers, and sometimes it's dramatized violence. And she'll always poke fun at me and say, well, how many people do you kill in those games? And so usually we joke about this, but the other day we were actually, discussing this, it just came up in a kind of a more formalized context, and we were actually talking about this a little bit more seriously. And I, had some, I'm not sure if they were revelations, but I was able to kind of put a few pieces together and realize, where the schism was, if anything. And, I don't particularly like really violent movies. I'm not a person that likes horror. I don't like jump horror movies. Even to a certain extent, some kind of books, it gets a little bit too much. Now, we were talking about the movies that we watch, for example, and I was giving the example of I might like to watch a kind of lighthearted action movie. They're not all lighthearted, but they're all, they're very kind of over the top. And so maybe hundreds of people die, but they're nameless, faceless people for the most part. The deaths are sanitized. There's not this real zoom in for the most part of some real brutal murder. It is just part of the action. Even if they are main characters, it's somehow it's sanitized. You know what I mean? And whereas the movies that she tends to gravitate towards, they're very human. There's the begging, the pleading, the sounds, it's real brutal murder. It's the kind of brutal murder that you might find in Circle of Ants, which, oddly enough, I'm really gung-ho to go play. And I'm glad it looks like we're going to actually end up going playing this. So what's the difference? Why would I not like that in a dramatized fashion? Even in some of the books I read, there's a certain line that I'm like, it's just not doing it for me. It's a little bit too graphic. But in a gaming situation, why would, even though this game calls for lines and veils, like establish where your lines are, establish what you want veiled, why am I less likely to even want to use those, or at least not call for them myself in a game? Why would that make any sort of sense? And, I thought about it and I realized that there's this certain level of, or illusion of control over the situation that I have as a player and as a game master when I'm in the game. And it's not just an illusion. I can actually make decisions as the character. There may be a certain point where the character is now helpless, but I can still sort of try to make decisions. And, I thought about this, and I don't know if you ever had this experience, but I had this 1972 Le Mans I loved to death, and I cried when it got hit. And, if I could have any car back, that's one of the cars that's way up on my list. And this thing was a rocket. And as a young man, I drove it way too fast. But I felt safe doing that. But if I was in somebody else's car with an equally, badass car, and they drove it the way I drove my car, I did not feel safe. There really was no difference. I simply had my hand on the wheel and my feet on the pedals. I had this feeling of somehow having some mode of control over this. And even to this day, depending on who's driving, sometimes I'd rather be driving just because I feel a little safer. I'm not probably safer at all. In fact, I might be a worse driver. You get the idea. There's this sensation of actually having your hands on the wheel, some level, on some levers, on some methods of means of control, on the dice, on the decisions of the character. And so I found that kind of interesting. The more I thought about that, I feel safer exploring these sorts of things, safer experiencing these things like, say, the brutal nature of humanity, and kind of actually eager to do it in a situation where either as a game master I have some level of control over what happens, and I've played that in other games, certainly in Lamentations and Prussia. I made some horrible things happen to these poor guys. But as a character, I feel it's I'm not sure if safe is the right word, but there's this ability to have some level of control And I'm sure you can go way down the rabbit hole of my psyche and talk about my childhood and how like having control would have been a nice thing, but that's something I had none of, and it was not the nicest childhood in the world, and we'll end there. But that's probably where some of that stuff comes from. But it's really kind of interesting little revelation I had there, because at the end of the day, there's a context where I want to look at some of the dark side of life, and that could be simply things like the mythos. And controlling a character through that, or in something a lot more visceral and more human and more, I think, maybe not more visceral, but something that's more relatable, such as brutal killing and all the other horrible things that people do to each other. But having some level of involvement, and whether that means that I put up a frame between myself and the character if it gets a little bit too much, or strengthen that frame, or whether more likely, I think for me, it's just the fact that I have this ability to make the decisions as the character, even if they're tumbling down the slippery slope with no chance of ever getting back up. That feeling of having my hands on the wheel, so to speak. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So what about you? Have you ever experienced something like that? Because I certainly like dark themes in RPGs, but it's funny because if I see a parallel in some other kinds of media, I don't like it. What does that say about me? What does that say about you? Tell me about it.